Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me as I compare the nutrition facts for pasta. My name is Kristen, and today I'm going to walk you through the different elements on a food label, such as the serving size, the way the calories are calculated, and the different types of macronutrients. But more specifically, we're going to compare the nutrition facts for pastas. Who doesn't love some pasta? I'm Italian, and pasta was always the main course at our Sunday dinners growing up. And for those of my non-Italian friends out there, Sunday dinners start at 1 o'clock. So today we're going to look at three different types. We're going to look at our traditional pasta, gluten-free, and whole grain pasta. And what you learn might actually surprise you. Now, disclaimer, I'm not a nutritionalist or a doctor. I'm just someone who tries to make healthier decisions. I do have a life coach certification, so I did learn a little bit more about the different types of fats and carbs, which are the healthy ones, those that you should limit, and those that you might want to try to avoid altogether. But at the end of the day, the choice is yours. So let's get started. Here we have the nutritional facts for three different types of pasta. We have traditional, whole grain, and gluten-free pasta. And in this case, all three of them are penne. So let's start at the top with the servings and the serving size. This provides the number of servings in the entire package and the size of what's considered a single serving. All the values below that are going to be based on a single serving. So be mindful of the amount that you plan on eating. If you eat more than the recommended serving size, you have to remember that you need to increase the number of calories, fats, carbs, and sugars that you're intaking. So in a 16-ounce box of pasta, there's about 8 servings. The gluten-free one has a few less servings in this case. Now, looking at the serving size across all three types, it's about 3/4 of a cup, or about 2 ounces. So again, as we're going through this exercise, keep in mind, if you were to eat half a box of pasta, you should triple or quadruple all the nutritional facts. So below the serving size, we're going to see the total calories. We can see to start off that the whole grain has about 180 calories per serving, which is the lowest of the three choices. The regular pasta has the highest calories at about 200 calories per serving. And then the gluten-free pasta falls kind of right in the middle at 190. So far, the whole grain choice has the lowest calories per serving. Now, calories are calculated based on the grams of fats, carbohydrates, and proteins in the food. So for each gram of fat, there's 9 calories. For each gram of carbohydrates and proteins, there's 4. So if we look at the traditional penne in this case, we have 1 gram of fat at 9 calories, which would be 9. We have 41 grams of carbs at 4 calories, which would be 164 calories. And then we have 7 grams of protein at 4 calories, which would be about 28 calories. So now if we add them together, it's about 201 calories. Now we can see this box is saying that it's about 200 calories per serving. So it's not completely exact, but you have to take into account rounding. So now let's look down a little bit and take a look at the grams of fat in the pastas. The total fat is pretty close across all three of these varieties. We have about 1 gram in the regular and in the gluten-free. And then we have about 1.5 grams in the whole grain, which is a little bit more. So below you can see saturated fat and trans fat. Now, these are the unhealthy fats. That's why they're listed on the label. These are the types of fats that typically would solidify at room temperature, and they're generally associated with medical illnesses, such as maybe high cholesterol or heart disease. So it's recommended that you eat less than 10% of saturated fat and about less than 1% of trans fat in your daily calorie intake. So essentially, you want to limit your saturated fats and try to avoid the trans fat altogether if possible. Now, in our case here, the unhealthy fats are listed as 0 across all three pastas. But there's still 1 or 1.5 grams of fat in each of the boxes. So where's that fat coming from? Well, first, if a food contains less than 0.5 grams of trans fat, a company does not have to list it as 0.5. They can actually list the amount as 0. The second thing to keep in mind is that there's also healthier fats, such as monounsaturated, polyunsaturated fat, and also omega fatty acids. So because they're the healthier fats, they're not required to be listed on the label. So you might not really typically see them on the label, but you can assume that those are most likely the types of fats that would make up the difference. So moving down to cholesterol. Cholesterol is displayed in milligrams, and it's recommended that your total cholesterol intake be about less than 200 milligrams per day. Sodium is also listed in milligrams, and the recommended daily intake for sodium is less than 1,500 or 2,000 milligrams per day, depending on which article you're reading. The good news here, though, is that none of these pastas contain cholesterol or sodium. But again, keep in mind, 0 may mean an amount that's low enough that it's not required to be posted, but there still might be traces of it in the foods. So let's move down a little bit and take a look at carbohydrates. Are carbs good? Are they bad? Who knows? But carbohydrates are typically listed in total grams. And then they're also broken down a little bit further so that you can better understand what the carbs are, like what's included in the carbohydrates. So if we start off taking a look at what we have here, we have about 39 total carbs in our whole grain pasta, which does kind of sound like a lot, but let's see how the other two measure up. We have about 41 grams in our traditional pasta, so we have about 2 more grams than the whole wheat. And then what surprised me was that there's actually 44 grams in the gluten-free, which is the highest out of any of the pennes. But there are some healthier carbohydrates. For example, dietary fiber. Fiber is a good thing. It helps with your digestion. It helps breaking down the foods that we're eating. What's the unhealthier carb is the simple carbs, and that's your sugars. And what that does is it typically spikes your blood sugar, leads to what's considered like a sugar crash, and it typically makes us hungrier sooner and causes us to crave more carbs. So here's kind of where we start to see a little bit of a difference in the variations of the penne, kind of in the fiber content. So if we look at the dietary fiber, we have only about 2 grams of fiber in our traditional and our gluten-free penne. But we have about 7 grams of fiber in the whole grain pasta. And that's about 25% of the recommended amount of daily fiber intake, which is about 25 grams for the day. Now, if you look under the fiber, some labels may actually list it out as soluble and insoluble fiber. And both of those are beneficial in the digestive process. Below the dietary fiber, we actually have the sugars. In whole grain, we have about 1 sugar, while the other 2, the gluten-free and the traditional, have 0 sugars. Now, if we think back to the fats, we can see that the saturated and the trans fat didn't totally equal up to the total fat. Same situation happens here. We have the total dietary fiber along with the sugar, but that's not what the total carbs adds up to. So what do the rest of the carbohydrates consist of? Well, in the case of pasta, the additional carbs are most likely starches. For whole grain, the whole grain starch, which is not processed like refined starch, is usually it usually has a higher nutritional value, and that's why whole grain is typically considered a healthier choice. And then finally, we see the total grams of protein listed. Now, protein promotes lean muscle, and it helps you stay satisfied longer after a meal. So the higher the protein content, the better. Now, in this case, we can see that the whole grain pasta has about 8 grams of protein, where the traditional pasta has 7, so not too much less, but the gluten-free version only has 4 grams, which is the least out of any of our varieties here. So now that we've broken down the nutritional facts of the 3 pastas, which should we choose? So since the whole grain penne contains less calories per serving, has higher dietary fiber, higher protein, and it comes from whole grains, and whole grains typically contain additional nutrients and they're a little bit healthier for you, my choice would most likely be the whole grain pasta, especially since I would most likely be adding cheese and sauce and probably meat, which would all add to the number of calories, fats, carbs, and sugars in the meal. But that will be a whole different video, so stay tuned. So that wraps it up. Thanks for sticking with me. And now remember that the nutritional facts for pasta are not the only thing that you should consider. If you have a gluten sensitivity, you'd want to use a gluten-free pasta. But this video is really only intended to better help you understand how to read the nutritional labels so that you have that knowledge and you can make those decisions across different food products. So I hope you had fun watching the video. I hope you learned a little something along the way. And if you did, share it with your friends. Thanks so much.